You're listening to Arsenal for Democracy, episode 331, recorded on Sunday, November 1st, 2020. I'm your host, Bill Humphrey. Joining me on the line this week is Nate. Hello, Nate.
Great to be here, Bill.
So, Nate, we are going to be talking this week about Gaspar Yanga and his maroon colony in the late 1500s, early 1600s in Veracruz area of Mexico. Now, a maroon colony is a British English or American English term for escaped slave sort of commune. The Spanish would have called them cimarrons, but we're going to use the term maroon just for consistency through most of this episode. And why are we talking about it this year? Well, interestingly, there was a rap music video that came out earlier this year featuring Snoop Dogg that mentioned or alluded to this particular figure who we're going to be talking about this episode. So, Nate, what was the deal with that?
Well, to quote President Trump, I guess you could say that Yanga is being recognized more and more. You know, his famous thing that he said about Frederick Douglass seeming to imply that he was still alive. But this was, a while ago, so I don't think there's any chance. But there is actually still a town of Yanga that we'll probably talk about. And yeah, so I'd urge people to check out the music video, sort of a not super connected to any of this, but that's the title of the song or whatever. So sort of has a little bit of a hook there.
Yes. So, as I said, the events that we're going to be talking about took place in the late 1500s, early 1600s in what is now the state of Veracruz in Mexico. Veracruz was, of course, the base of operations for Hernan Cortez to conquer the Aztecs in the early 1500s. And this was an area at the time that we're going to be talking about that, as it is still today, grew a great deal of sugarcane. And as was the case in the Caribbean plantation colonies of the European powers, sugarcane plantations generally equaled a lot of imported forced labor slavery. So we're going to be talking about this figure, Gaspar Yanga, who is also referred to as El Primer Libertador de las Americas, the first liberator of the Americas. And we looked at a bunch of different sources for this, but our big source was an article with that title in this publication called Callaloo, which this article came out in 2008. It's available on JSTOR, and it went over not only the history that we're aware of surrounding this figure, but also went over sort of the historiography, which is kind of the state of how people write about the history of this guy and his maroon colony of escaped slaves in Veracruz. So just to go over some sort of statistics here from the JSTOR article, although this author was quoting various other authors here, during the peak years of Mexican slavery from 1521 to 1639, the colony, known as the Kingdom of New Spain, ranked high among the leading New World importers, receiving roughly half of all slaves entering the Indies. Total slave imports for the period amounted to over 110,525 persons. In 1640, the year the Portuguese slave trade to Spanish America ended, the Kingdom of New Spain, or colonial Mexico, contained the second largest after Brazil population of enslaved Africans and the greatest number of free blacks in the Americas. And that latter point is going to be important because a lot of that has to do with the legacy left by Gaspar Yanga and his community in sort of familiarizing the Spanish colonial administration in Mexico with the possibility of having significant populations of free blacks around. In 1570, this would have been about 51 years after Cortez had arrived, Gaspar Yanga, a slave in the sugarcane plantations near Veracruz, led a bloody rebellion of those slaves and led those rebels into the mountains where they found an inaccessible place where they could settle and found a small town of approximately 500 people. To ensure supplies, Yanga ambushed the Spanish caravans that were bringing goods to Veracruz. Yanga established relations with the neighboring slaves and Indians. During more than 30 years, Yanga and his followers lived free. And that is from the 1842 history by Perez de Ribas. And we'll get back again to this issue of 19th century historiography of this figure. In 1608, Viceroy Luis de Velasco decided to negotiate with the Cimarrones, the escaped slaves, sending Padre Alonso de Benavides, a Franciscan friar, and Captain Manuel Carrillo, a regidor of Veracruz, to negotiate a treaty with Yanga, who was the leader of the Palenque, which was a term for this sort of band of, raiding escaped slaves and so forth. Padre Benavides and Captain Carrillo successfully established a truce by the end of 1608 with Yanga, who was considered to be, or is believed to have been, at least in some historical accounts, from the Senegambia region of northwestern Africa, who had been a runaway for nearly 30 years and claimed to be a descendant of African royalty. That was according to another source that was cited in the JSTOR article from Callaloo. Now, there is a little bit of debate on the exact timing of things. So it seems likely that his uprising, although not even the first on the sugarcane plantations around Veracruz, was somewhere around 1570. And it seems that there was an attempt to have some sort of a truce in 1608, but the following year, in 1609, there was one last military attempt to once and for all suppress this free, sort of unrecognized colony of maroon escaped slaves. And that eventually, at some point, it's a little unclear from reading all these historical sources, it's unclear to me whether it was in 1609 or maybe 1617, 1618, it might have lasted a little bit longer in terms of when they reached a final settlement. But this is why this guy is such an unusual figure, and his band of escaped slaves are such an unusual group of people. So Captain Carrillo led a force of Spanish troops into the mountains in 1609 to try to destroy Yanga's settlement, and the Maroon forces made the smart choice of simply abandoning their little informal town of 500 people and went deeper into the mountains and continued guerrilla warfare against the Spanish until the Spanish expedition collapsed so completely that they were actually forced to accept demands from Yanga. So, back to the main source here that we're relying on today. Gaspar and Yanga, for whom the municipality of Yanga was named, is a symbol, however, unacknowledged for all of the Americas. During the late 16th and 17th centuries, Yanga and his fellow freedom fighters successfully fought against and eluded Spanish soldiers and later negotiated with official representatives of the Spanish crown for land and for certain human and civil rights. Using tactics of their own devising and negotiating strategies of their own making, these African freedom fighters in colonial Mexico founded and developed the first free town in the Americas, and their fearless leader, Gaspar Yanga, would, in the 20th century, come to be dubbed the Primer Libertador de America, first liberator of the Americas, by the people of Yanga. The town of Yanga was established at some point, as I said, we're a little unclear on the exact timing, after that 1609 raid and whatever the final peace settlement was reached. And this was a settlement between the Maroon colony forces under Gaspar Yanga and the Spanish colonial government. And it was nearby where that Maroon base in the mountains had been, but it was actually down out of the mountains with better land. So their final settlement wasn't just that they were allowed to live in peace in the town that they had been hiding in this whole time for, 30 or 40 years, but it was actually that they were able to live on better land and, do farming and things like that. Of course, it should probably be no surprise that the Spanish also built a military base nearby to keep an eye on this large group of now free blacks living in their own community. During the decades-long period of rebellion from the mountains, Gaspar Yanga delegated military command to another escaped African slave, reportedly from Angola, although I've read some sources that indicate that sometimes the accounts in the 19th century and so forth refer to people who were actually from the Congo as being from Angola, so I don't know if that's the case there. But Gaspar dealt with most of the governance matters himself, at least from what we know, but that is based not on contemporary information, but more on Mexican history over 2 centuries later in the 19th century. We're going to talk in just a second about that 19th century history writing about this topic. But first, let's talk about what was included in Yanga's treaty with the Spanish authorities, and for that we're going to go to the translation provided by the historian Jane Landers.
Yeah, just quickly, Bill, the quote-unquote Angolan warrior went by the name Francisco de la Matiza, and I guess he was sort of the leader of the Yanga's freedom fighters there, and once they were driven away from their town where they had planted seedlings, cotton, sweet potatoes, chilies, tobacco, squash, corn, beans, sugarcane, and other vegetables, then they started stealing or raiding they intensified the raiding of supply caravans or other quote-unquote free people that were allied with the Spanish. So that sort of led the troops under the command of Gonzalez de Herrera basically started seeing that they can't win. So that led to these demands. The article notes that there was sort of a threat implied in this too. It's like, if we don't get these things, we're going to continue to be a problem for you. So that's sort of what makes this treaty interesting. So we'll go over these. Okay, so the translation: the conditions that the black Maroons of this region ask for, that all who fled before last September will be free, and those who flee after that time will be returned to their owners. So we'll talk about that probably in a second. They must have a chief judge who shall not be a mestizo or grillo or letrado, or rather be a warrior. Don't exactly know some of those terms there. That no Spaniard will have a house to stay in or within the town, excepting during the markets. They will have their own town on Mondays and Thursdays, so keep the Spanish from living in the main town. They must have a councilman and a town council. That the captain Yanga, who is their leader, must be governor, and after him his sons and descendants. That they obligate themselves to return to their owners the blacks who fled to them from the ports, and for their work the blacks who track and return the runaways will be paid 12 pesos. Until they return the runaways, they will provide their owners with others of their own who will serve them, and if they do not return them, they will pay their owners their value. So also controversial. We'll probably talk about that. And within a year and a half, they'll be given their charter confirmed by your majesty, and if not, they will return to their original state. That their town must be founded between the Rio Blanco and the estates of Ribadenera, which they indicate. They will pay tribute to your majesties like the rest of the free blacks and mulattoes of the Indies. The last condition they request is Franciscan friars and no others minister to them, and the cost of ornaments for the church be paid by your majesty. And they will need to present themselves with arms every time your majesty has need to defend the land. So those are the 12 demands there.
So Nate, as you said, there are two particularly controversial points in here that seem to be concessions in order to get the rest of the deal. Yes, there's an implied threat that if they don't get the rest of their demands met, that they will return to raiding, harassment, guerrilla operations, and assisting freed slaves. But they did make a fundamental compromise here to integrate themselves into the colonial Spanish administration in Mexico. So what do we think about that? I mean, it's hard to obviously put ourselves in their shoes and their perspective of why they made that decision. But as you noted, point one is that there's a cutoff on when slaves are allowed to flee to them and become free. And point six is that they are going to assist in repatriating escaped slaves to their owners in other parts of the nearby area of Veracruz, Mexico. This was not an unqualified victory, I guess we'll say, right?
Right, yeah. Although, I mean, I guess you would say that in looking into some of this history and seeing that there were many of these like Cimarron or Maroon slave rebellions, or small societies that get set up and then do conflict with the colonial authorities, there were many instances where that's how the groups were sustained, was like freeing slaves or trying to go back in during the night, I guess, to try to convince other slaves to flee as well and join them. So this was sort of, I guess, whatever you could get away with, or whatever was the easiest, the way that would ensure the entire group was not descended upon by the Spanish. So obviously a difficult situation.
Yeah, so it seems like in order to get this town, they did agree that they weren't going to continue. And who knows, maybe they didn't actually follow that provision. Maybe
right.
they were
it's
continuing
been centuries,
to,
so it's tough to know.
And as we'll talk about as well, those last two conditions surrounding religious faith and the point about they will present themselves with arms every time your majesty has need of them to defend the land. We're going to circle back to that in just a bit, because that is also an important legacy for the remainder of Spanish operations in the Americas. But before we get to that, let's talk again about the history. It's a little bit difficult to know some of the exact details of what happened here, partly because this was not something that was being played up by the Spanish authorities in Mexico while they still retained power there. This is not something that really gained prominence until after the Spanish had been kicked out and Mexico had gained its independence. As far as I could tell from this source, this article that we were reading in Callaloo, the real sort of surge in interest, which subsequently led to them renaming this town to Yanga in his honor, the interest within the Mexican historiography on Gaspar and Yanga was promoted in the late 19th century, very specifically by the descendants of two early Mexican presidents who were both of African heritage. So, as it's noted in point 2 of those demands in the treaty, there was a little bit of reluctance to, or unwillingness to conflate across racial lines what was going on here. But subsequently, over many generations, a lot of people did integrate. And, there was already this mestizo class that was of white and indigenous mixed heritage. I assume that Criollo is also kind of referring to that. And then there was the, fully European Spanish class that was also in power. And then there were these people who were either slaves or descended from slaves. And then there was mixing between that population and the indigenous population and also the mestizo. So you would have Afro-Indigenous people, you would have Afro-Mestizo people, and so forth. That debate in Mexico after independence was like, how do we create a national identity with all these different mixed people? What is the unifying narrative that's going to have a common thread here? How do we make sure that all these black military generals involved in the revolutionary politics of the resistance to Spain, these two presidents that were elected in the 19th century, or however they came to power, because sometimes the presidents weren't elected and just seized power. I don't know the specifics on one of them. How do we create that new national identity for Mexico? And one of the answers here was to take a figure like Gaspar Yanga and say, look, there is a long history going back to the late 1500s of black population in Mexico, both resisting the Spanish, but also carving out their own recognized community as part of the Mexican state, or at least at that time, the colonial Spanish state in Mexico. That cooperation with indigenous peoples, between the escaped slaves and the indigenous peoples, this was a way of generating that new sort of identity. And that was why there was this surge of interest in the 19th century, especially the later 19th century, after the Spanish had been gone for a while and they were still trying to cement that concept of a unified national identity. They wanted everyone involved. So that was the motive of those people. But of course, that means that we're getting a lot of this information kind of second or third hand with several centuries removed, even before we talk about the remove from us to the 19th century. So it can be a little bit, dicey to know how much of that stuff is true, but that seems to be kind of what we know about it. Again, that timeline that somewhere around 1570, one of these many sugarcane slave rebellions led to this sort of breakaway guerrilla mountain operation, and that was so successful by the early 1600s that the Spanish colonial authorities had to make peace with them and recognize that they were going to have a permanent settlement. There's a lot of other information as well that we haven't gone over today that's going to be in the notes at arsenalfordemocracy.com that talks about some more of these different perspectives and how many revolts were happening even before Yanga. It talks as well about kind of what stuff they were growing, how they were surviving before they made this peace, and the various efforts, because there were multiple attempts where the Spanish in the early 1600s tried to put this down with military force before they ultimately concluded that they simply could not. They were going to need to come up with a peace deal. And so that seems that sometime between 1609 and 1617, this free town was chartered. But this did have a pretty important impact. As Nate said in the final point, they will present themselves with their arms every time your majesty has need of them to defend the land. That leads to, maybe not directly, but certainly I think probably influenced their thinking. 7 decades later, this would have been the late 1600s and into the early 1700s, Spanish policy in Florida was to actively encourage slaves from the British colonies to the north to run away to Spanish Florida, with the King of Spain officially welcoming escaped slaves as long as they pledged to serve as an armed defense force for St. Augustine for 4 years, and if they weren't already, they were supposed to convert to Catholicism, which again ties back to that point, and has some things to do with the history of Africa, continental Africa itself. There were areas of Africa that slaves were being taken from that were already Catholic, but not to get too far off track there. But this was those sort of two points from the final treaty seem like they are being at least echoed in the later arrangement in Florida, that, of course, many people are familiar with the concept of black Seminoles and so forth. In the late 1730s, as the conflict between the Spanish and the British was heating up, nearby Fort Mose became the first specifically maroon settlement established there for runaways, under the command of escaped African slave captain Francisco Menendez, and that was probably the first officially slavery-free community in North America since Gaspar and Yanga's town in Mexico over a century before, and Fort Mose played a key role in the War of Jenkins' Ear that Kelly and I discussed in episode 329 2 weeks ago, and that may have inspired the Stonos Rebellion, a slave uprising in South Carolina, which is part of the paranoia in 1741 New York City about a possible slave uprising that we talked about on that earlier episode. The Fort Mose and St. Augustine freedmen communities, eventually numbering several thousand former slaves in Spanish Florida, had to be evacuated to Cuba to build a new maroon settlement after the French and Spanish defeat in the French and Indian War in the 1760s. So what it seems like here is that this was not exactly a sweeping precedent for the Spanish to, do all over the place, but they certainly, after the experiment with Gaspar and Yanga, were at least willing to explore this as a potential option because there was this way of kind of co-opting escaped slaves and slave rebellions into the broader purposes of the state. Nate, before we wrap up here, I know you wanted to briefly touch upon some of the other surrounding context not related to Gaspar and Yanga, but sort of similar things in the Spanish colonies.
Yeah, just looking at there's a number of various maroon rebellions or wars or various things of that nature. There's the Bayano Wars. There's massive slave uprising in Panama in 1600s or around 16th century, around 1552, I think. There was another Maroon leader, Miguel de Buria, who became, I think, like king of a small state in what is now Lara, Venezuela, and fought against the Spanish and was eventually killed, I believe, in a giant battle. So there's something like that. Then also recently, just this year, there's been some impact of what we've been talking about because in Suriname, they just elected a person who's descended from the Maroon communities, Ronnie Brunswick, and he was just elected vice president, took office in June. But he had been involved in I guess it's called the Suriname Interior War during the 80s, and the dictator at that time basically sent like a military unit to his village and massacred a bunch of people, killed like 36 people in his village or something. So there was, I guess, a guerrilla movement called Jungle Commando, mostly populated by Maroon freedom fighters who basically, they've been doing battle against the Surinamese government, and I guess there was a truce in 91. But yeah, I mean, these issues are still very relevant today, and we've talked previously about the Atlantic world, this sort of intermixing of all these various communities, whether they're indigenous, whether they're Africans who are enslaved and brought over, or whether it's the colonial authorities. These create these sort of scenarios that we've seen, and just looking through the history, it seems like there's a lot of these different scenarios and these communities which spring up because obviously, you don't want to be a slave. You don't want to be controlled by the colonial authorities over in Madrid or whatever, forcing you to grow sugarcane. So people rebelled, and we're seeing all these instances throughout the centuries, which is, in a lot of these history, you might learn about Nat Turner or something, and then that's sort of it. Or Denmark Vesey, but there's a lot of these instances out there.
That is kind of why I wanted to talk about Gaspar Yanga and his colony near Veracruz, because I felt like that was one that doesn't get that much attention in that overall narrative because there were obviously so many different slave insurrections. And this one's kind of inspiring because, there were certainly some compromises as we talked about, but overall, you can consider this one to have been a pretty solid victory, which was relatively unusual compared to most of these. And as we said, there is that tie-in to present day where it was being highlighted and emphasized earlier this year with that song featuring Snoop Dogg. So, Nate, thank you so much for coming on this week to talk about Gaspar Yanga and his maroon colony in colonial Mexico. I think it was a really interesting discussion.
Great to be here, Bill. Thanks.